So one of the flaws, in case you've thought about this, maybe you have, one of the flaws in the makeup of DC Comics Justice League is how overpowered Superman is, right? In order to have any drama about the outcome, Superman needs to be missing from the group, right? He's off doing something else, or he's distracted by something, or of course the fail-safe, when the writers don't have any other way out of it, they just have to have kryptonite to slow him down for a while. But when Superman gets into the fight, when he's there, when he's ready to go, it's game over. One villain, two villains, a whole army of villains, it doesn't matter. They can't stop him. Marvel actually has the same issue with its team up in the Avengers, and they have to find a reason to send Captain Marvel somewhere else until the plot needs her to come back. Well, I thought of that because in moral theology, there is a question called the problem of evil. In a nutshell, it asks this question, and this is a formulation that ancient Greek philosophers came up with. This is not a new conversation. They said, if God or the gods or whatever are all powerful and God is all good, well, how can he allow evil to exist at all? Couldn't figure that out. God could, it seems to us, stop evil even easier than Superman or Captain Marvel. So why doesn't God do that? That actually is the question of our text this morning. And since we have 2 weeks before the Advent season begins, we're going to spend 2 of them looking at 2 deep questions that the prophet Habakkuk brings to us. And so we're going to look at the first one in chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. It says, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Now, Habakkuk is one of those names, right, that you recognize. That's a Bible name, right? I might not remember anything about him other than that's a good old Bible name, right? It's actually one that people don't name their kids much anymore for some particular reason or other. We got a lot of Joshuas and Davids and whatnot, but not too many. I've never known a Habakkuk. Maybe it's because it just they were worried about it spelling and whatnot. Honestly, you're not far off by saying, I don't know anything about the prophet Habakkuk, because we don't know anything about the prophet Habakkuk other than the fact that his name is attached to this scripture. We don't know exactly when he lived. We know the time period. We don't know where he was from. We don't know anything about his personal life because there's no narrative here. The text isn't giving us anything other than this and then just the prophecy. So his word from the Lord, it came about, again, it's somewhere in here, about a generation before Jerusalem was ransacked and burned by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So his message, to give you sort of a time frame, is about 150 years after Jonah experienced God's mercy toward Nineveh. So it's been a few generations since that moment. And as that choice by God shocked and upset Jonah, right? Jonah was like, what are you doing, God? Don't have mercy on Nineveh. That's not fair, yada, yada. Habakkuk is similarly confounded by God's choices, and he wants answers. In the generations between the fall of the 10 northern tribes in 722 and the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in 586. So during that 150-year period in which this takes place, the kingdom of Judah swung back and forth between God-honoring good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah and really evil men like Manasseh and Amon. It was a tumultuous time where Judah sought allies against regional empires, right? Egypt, will you be our ally against Assyria? That kind of thing. Where reforms, they helped, but they didn't solve the problems of idolatry, the problems of the way that the poor and powerless were being treated. So in that uncertainty, Habakkuk asks a question as old as the story of Cain and Abel. Where is God when evil happens? Here's how he phrased it. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? We don't know how long Habakkuk cried out to God without receiving the answer that he's pleading for here. It could have been months, it could have been years. He was, to borrow from the comics again, I think this is the last time, he was turning on the bat signal, and Batman never shows up to fight crime. And he's saying, hey, where are you? In all honesty, Habakkuk didn't know if God was listening to his cries for help. But the violence, it hadn't stopped. It hadn't been stopped, supernaturally or any other way. So Habakkuk assumed that he was stuck waiting on hold, unable to get through to God. The prophet's frustration is not new. Many righteous men and women through the centuries have looked at the world that we live in and wondered about God's choice to be seemingly less involved than we would prefer him to be. This conversation is, to an extent, a parallel to the story of Job. Because in Job is wrestling with personal level questions of justice. Justice on the one man and his family kind of level. Habakkuk is wrestling with those same questions elevated to society as a whole. So if you think about the questions and the conversations in the book of Job, that's one man and his friends talking about whether or not his situation is just or unjust, deserved or undeserved, fair or unfair. Here Habakkuk is raising similar questions and saying, we got a whole country here that I want that answer about. So he continues, he says, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. One of the things that made Habakkuk's frustration acute is that it was happening in his own culture and among his own people. No, nobody likes to hear about war and strife in far-off countries that you may or may not remember where they are because you didn't pay attention in geography, because most people don't. But it's quite another thing when those human failings are on our doorstep, when it's in your own family, your own community, your own country. So on top of that frustration of it being right here in his lap, Judah is, as a kingdom, is supposed to be different from their neighbors in a whole host of ways, including being a place where injustice is rare and not rampant, where the bonds of brotherhood limit violence and strife, because all of the people there recognize that they're part of the same covenantal people. And yet it's not. These are Abraham's descendants. They're the people who followed Moses out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. They have a temple where God's glory dwells. They have a priesthood. They have festivals and sacrifices. All of these things together designed to draw the people closer to God. And, of course, they have the law of Moses stipulating the ways in which the people are supposed to interact with each other for fairness and justice and righteousness. So it would be one thing for the Assyrians or the Egyptians to behave like this. Their gods, of course, are just wood and stone. They're just idols. How can this be happening when a people worship the one true God who has shown them his power? He has included them in his plans for humanity. In fact, he gave them the lead role. He even sends them judges and prophets to call them back when they've strayed. How can this be happening here? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be happening in this land and with this people. And yet Habakkuk can see with his own eyes, it is. So there's another factor that we need to remember before we see what he says next. The covenant at Sinai contained the promise of blessings for obedience that everybody loves to talk about, and curses for disobedience. So while Habakkuk would like to know, what's going on with my own people? Why are we doing this? At this point, the responsibility has shifted to God. God had promised in Moses' day, I will not tolerate such chaos. In the intervening generations, he has acted many times to fulfill his covenant by judging his people's failures. Many examples in the generations before this one. So Habakkuk is asking God, what about now? You did something in Gideon's day. You did something in this generation, in that generation. What about now? Because he says, therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. The covenant that God gave his chosen people at Sinai had numerous mechanisms built into it to protect the innocent, the weak, and the powerless. A system, as you well know, is only as good as the people who are implementing it. And Habakkuk's fellow Israelites in the kingdom of Judah during the 6th century BC were not letting the system work. Now, some, no doubt, were trying to live by it. It was never everybody that was righteous or everybody that was wicked. It's always somewhere in between. And sure, some of them, maybe even some of them, are elders and judges who are trying to protect the downtrodden with the covenant's stipulations. But they are being overwhelmed by the breadth and the depth of the wickedness. So Habakkuk says justice doesn't stand a chance. Now, the book of Ruth offers us an example of a good man, Boaz, following the law and ensuring that the poor can glean from the corners of his fields. And it shows Ruth and Naomi depending on that kindness that was built into the covenant. Unfortunately, those days are gone. So if Boaz's obedience was common a few generations before King David, because Ruth becomes one of his foremothers, it is decidedly uncommon in Habakkuk's day. Now, the law of Moses was never designed by God to create some sort of ideal society that would be copied by all peoples and places and times. That's not what it was. But if it had been followed, Israel would have created a society that was a whole lot better than anything else that existed in the ancient Near East. Sadly, as we learn from reading Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Nahum, Obadiah, Zephaniah, and now Habakkuk, Israel only sporadically and never fully lived as an entire kingdom according to the covenant. So it's not uncommon to idealize the past as the good old days. You guys aren't the first generation to do that. Your parents thought the same thing, and so did your grandparents about parts of change that was happening. But in Israel's case, we have the reminder from Holy Scripture that this failure to fully embrace their covenant obligations wasn't a matter about the good old days, because this is a multi-generational, self-inflicted wound going all the way back to the generation of Joshua and all the way to this one. So to return to Habakkuk's question, what is God going to do about it? The answer is not what Habakkuk expected. Verse 5 says, "Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." Now, the narrative doesn't explicitly say it, but you can tell here Habakkuk quit speaking. Now the Lord is answering. He's the I in question. So if the context around this statement was positive, this would be an exciting thing to hear from God, right? We would not want to wait to see, God, how are you going to utterly amaze? What are you going to do that no one would believe? Because time and time again, God has done things that nobody would have anticipated, even if a prophet predicted it. Of course, we'll be celebrating Advent soon, right? We know the ultimate example of God doing something that nobody saw coming. Certainly not the way he did it. Unfortunately, with this context, being that Habakkuk is questioning about why God isn't already crushing evildoers, these lines actually take on an ominous tone. God has also a history of judging in ways that nobody saw coming, ways that left a lasting impression on the survivors. Just ask Noah. That caught a lot of people by surprise and left an impression. Just ask Lot and his 2 daughters. Or you could ask the crushed remnant of the Egyptians after the plagues finally ended. Recall then that the evil that Habakkuk wants God to do something about is within his own covenantal people. It's in his nation. How could God purge that from the people who are already identified with his name? What can he do? God's reputation is on the line, not only within Israel, but in this whole region of neighboring nations who are witnessing the slide of Israel from a somewhat righteous people some generations before to a decidedly wicked one now. God's already sent prophets to warn his people to choose to change their ways. Apart from the brief revival under Josiah's reign, it didn't really work. So what now? If a warning, really a whole series of warnings, didn't work, what comes next? A parallel that we could think of course, would be in parenting. You've warned that kid who keeps breaking the rules. You've said, we're going to have some consequences, but nobody's listening. So what happens next? Well, here's what God's going to do. He says, I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. Well, God is right. They didn't see that one coming. People wouldn't have believed it if a prophet had said so. And a prophet is saying so right now, and the people aren't going to believe it. The Babylonians were a rising power in Habakkuk's day. They were in the process of toppling the Assyrians by destroying Nineveh. It's been 150 years or so, 100 and some odd years since Jonah. Now that judgment has come. From a historian's point of view, the Babylonians do have a better reputation than the universally hated, cruel Assyrians. That's something. But it won't make the neighboring peoples whom they're about to conquer and subjugate like them more. This, however, is God's solution. He's going to raise up a pagan nation to be the instrument of his wrath at his own rebellious people. It is actually the same method God used to punish the 10 northern tribes because of their idolatry and their wickedness. That time he used the Assyrians. Now he's going to use the Babylonians. They are a feared and dreaded people. They're a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Not that the Babylonians, note that the Babylonians are not given this role by God because they're a better people than Israel. They're not that at all. They're worse. But they don't have a covenant with God like Israel does, one that raises the stakes and the expectations. So in reality, there aren't any righteous people that God could use as his hands of judgment. If his answer is going to be given through human tools, bringing out his will, they're going to be flawed ones. That's the only kind he has to work with. It says, their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. The Babylonians won't be doing anything as part of God's response to Habakkuk's question that they weren't already seeking to do. The change that God is making known to Habakkuk, the shocking change that his people will not see coming and will not believe is coming, is that this time God will not intervene to protect Israel. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah and besieged Jerusalem in 701, God intervened. He delivered them by sending an angel to destroy Sennacherib's army. This time, however, when Nebuchadnezzar leads the Babylonians to Jerusalem and lays siege to it, God's judgment on Israel will keep him from delivering them once again. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. That dark day is coming when Jerusalem will fall, her people will be led to captivity, and the temple will be destroyed. It will be a horrific time. The people of God are going to suffer greatly. Now, it seems inconceivable in the ancient Near East, the way that they thought about the world and how it worked, that a God would allow this to happen to his people. Other peoples are going to assume that the God of Israel was defeated when the city of Jerusalem and the kingdom falls. They will assume that the invaders' God, the Babylonians' gods, were more powerful, and that's why this happened. The Israelites will be under no such delusion about the Lord when that day comes, however, for his prophets have predicted it and explained why God allowed it to happen. So unlike the mythical gods of the other peoples, the one true God cares about the moral behavior of his followers, and he will not tolerate them being an immoral people using his name. So either they are going to repent, which we know they're not, or they will be judged. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. You see, to the Babylonians, the fall of Jerusalem will be just another conquest to add to their list. It won't leave much of an impression. They'll soon be on to the next conquest, drunk on their own successes. But to Israel, it will be a turning point. The exile that will accompany it will shape them permanently. It will, for every generation, including up until now, impose upon them the lesson that God's covenant is to be taken seriously, and he will enforce it, even if it costs him dearly. So to return to the question in the sermon title, where is God when evil happens? Well, he told Habakkuk, God is right where he always is, deeply involved in humanity and working steadily to fulfill his plans and purposes. Habakkuk, he couldn't see what God was doing. The evil that men were doing had obscured his vision. That's an understandable result we can relate to. You can't see what God is doing sometimes because you're surrounded by evil. Yet God was, and in our day is too, moving forward. His plans and his promises will be fulfilled. In Habakkuk's day, there still was a Davidic king on the throne in Jerusalem. Yet it was all too clear that Israel needed to be rescued. The prophet's pleas had not changed the dynamic of rebellion against the covenant. And there was little hope that more or different prophets would be able to do it. No matter how many miraculous signs they performed, no matter how many times they told the people what the Lord had to say, it wouldn't make a permanent difference because human nature would always fall short of obeying God's commands. Now, God knew that, right? God had always known that this would be the case, which is why the covenant with Israel at Sinai was never meant to be a permanent solution. Its purpose was to pave the way for God's history-altering answer to the problem of evil in our world. We know what that answer was. God would come here in the flesh, become one of us, without the sin component, and open up the pathway to redemption and reconciliation through self-sacrifice. This is where God is when evil happens. God's holding out a future that exists without sin and death. God is holding out a time when sorrow will cease. And he's saying, everybody is welcome to join me in that future by grace through faith. So where is God when evil happens? Well, God is saving the world. God's bringing the lost home to him from every nation on earth. God is preparing for the day when he will judge the living and the dead, when he will end once and for all sin and death. 3 things to help you remember this text. Number 1, where is God when evil happens is an age-old question that we ought to ask. It is an important question to wrestle with. Number 2, the answer to it, though, includes God is working in ways that we do not anticipate. And I would add ways that we often do not see as well. Which brings us to this. It's not in Habakkuk, but it is, of course, the final answer. The final answer was not yet available in Habakkuk's day. It was offering salvation to the world through Jesus Christ. That's the answer to Habakkuk's question.